Lotharingia, 857 AD. The realm, a patchwork of fractured loyalties and simmering ambitions, lay heavy on the young King Lothair II's shoulders. He was the second son, unexpectedly ascended to the throne. Now the weight of expectation threatened to crush him. The paramount concern gnawing at Lothair was the matter of succession. His marriage to Ingeltrude had produced no heir, no guarantee for the future of his line. Each passing season ratcheted up the pressure from his nobles, each whispered counsel a reminder of his precarious position. Ingeltrude, his queen, once a symbol of hope, now represented a stark reality. Their union was barren, not only of children but also of affection. The political alliance it once forged had crumbled into dust, leaving behind only resentment and distrust. The king sought an annulment from Ingeltrude, a move fueled by both political necessity and personal longing. This proposal was met by a cold fury, each attempt widening the chasm between them. Word of Lothair's intentions reached Archbishop Hincmar of Reims. A staunch defender of the Church's doctrines and the sanctity of marriage, Hincmar viewed Lothair's quest for annulment with grave concern. To allow it would be an affront to God. Into this volatile mix stepped Adalberga. She was of noble lineage, known for her beauty and grace. When she came to court, she quickly caught the eye of the king. Lothair found himself increasingly drawn to Adalberga's gentle nature and sharp wit. He saw in her not just beauty, but a potential ally, someone who could understand his burdens and perhaps even bear him the heir he so desperately needed. Ingeltrude watched, her heart hardening with each stolen glance, each shared smile. The king's growing affection for Adalberga was a dagger twisting in her pride, fueling a quiet rage. Lothair, torn between duty and desire, confided in his most trusted adviser. He spoke of the kingdom's need for an heir, of his failing marriage, and of the unexpected hope he found in Adalberga's presence. Adalberga, aware of the king's affections, found herself caught in a web of ambition and circumstance. While drawn to Lothair's charisma and power, she understood the perilous nature of their situation and the potential consequences for them both. Hincmar, rallying his fellow clergymen, declared his unwavering opposition to Lothair's plans. He would not stand idly by while the king defied the sacred laws of marriage and jeopardized the stability of the realm. The stage was set. King Lothair stood at a precipice, his kingdom teetering on the edge of chaos. His choices, driven by ambition and desire, would determine not only his own destiny, but the future of the Carolingian Empire. Lothair found himself ensnared by the coils of matrimony, yet haunted by the specter of a kingdom without an heir. Canon law, an intricate web of doctrines, offered scant solace. Divorce, permissible only under the most stringent conditions, proven infidelity or consanguinity, loomed as a near impossibility. The future of Lotharingia hung precariously in the balance, dependent on an heir he did not have. Whispers, like tendrils of poison ivy, began to creep through the halls of the palace. Rumors of Ingeltrude's alleged infidelities, fueled by Lothair's court, spread like wildfire. These were more akin to strategic maneuvers than honest assessment of Ingeltrude's private life. Lothair in private council orchestrated the burgeoning narrative. Each accusation, carefully crafted and disseminated, aimed to undermine Ingeltrude's reputation and build a foundation for the desired annulment. His advisers, complicit in the scheme, nodded in agreement, their loyalty bought with promises of power and favor. News of Lothair's machinations reached the ears of Archbishop Hincmar. The prelate, a bulwark of moral rectitude, saw in Lothir's actions a grave threat to the sanctity of marriage and the authority of the Church. The foundation was set for a clash of wills that would test the very fabric of Lotharingia. The queen, no longer able to bear the weight of the accusations, confronted Lothir. Her plea, a desperate attempt to salvage her honor and position, fell on deaf ears. Lothir, hardened by his ambition, remained resolute in his pursuit of annulment. Lothir, employing his royal prerogative, convened a synod of bishops loyal to his cause. He skillfully manipulated the assembly, using promises of wealth and power to sway their opinions. The pressure mounted on the clerics to grant him the divorce he so desperately desired. Hincmar, undeterred by Lothir's machinations, dispatched missives to fellow bishops and to Pope Nicholas I in Rome. He implored them to uphold the sanctity of marriage and resist Lothir's unlawful demands. The lines of battle were drawn, the conflict escalating from a personal matter to a full-blown ecclesiastical crisis. Adalberga, the unwitting catalyst of this unfolding drama, became the subject of intense scrutiny. Her presence at court fueled the rumors and deepened the resentment towards Ingeltrude. She remained largely aloof, aware of her precarious position, but seemingly powerless to alter the course of events. The turmoil within Lotharingia did not go unnoticed by its neighbors. Envoys from surrounding kingdoms arrived, their expressions mirroring the growing anxiety over the kingdom's uncertain future. Lothir's obsession with his marital affairs had weakened his authority and made Lotharingia vulnerable to external threats. In Rome, Pope Nicholas I received Hincmar's plea with grave concern. A staunch defender of church doctrine, Nicholas recognized the danger posed by Lothir's defiance. He began to prepare a response that would shake the foundations of the Carolingian kingdom. In the shadows, Ingeltrude, far from being a passive victim, began to weave her own web of intrigue. She secretly met with disgruntled nobles, their resentment towards Lothir fueled by his disregard for tradition and the growing instability of the kingdom. The seeds of rebellion were sown. Lothir, blinded by his ambition and desire, remained oblivious to the storm gathering around him. He stood on the precipice of a crisis, the fate of his kingdom hanging in the balance, unaware of the true peril that awaited. The weight of Lotharingia pressed heavily upon Lothir. His desire for an heir had driven him to the precipice of open conflict with the Church, and now he needed to consolidate his support among the nobility. He summoned his most trusted advisers, their faces etched with concern. News of Lothir's machinations reached Hincmar in Reims. The archbishop, a bulwark of canon law, recognized the grave threat to the Church's authority and the stability of the realm. He began to correspond with other bishops, forging a coalition of opposition against the king's desires. Adalberga, though at the center of the storm, found herself with little power. She understood that her fate rested on Lothir's success, yet the opposition she faced was formidable. She could only wait and hope. Lothir convened a royal council, seeking to legitimize his actions through the support of his nobles. He argued for the necessity of an heir, painting Ingeltrude as barren and himself as a victim of circumstance. Yet, many remained unconvinced, wary of the Church's power. Ingeltrude, far from being a passive victim, seethed with resentment. She began to cultivate allies of her own, whispering accusations against Lothir and Adalberga, fueling the flames of discontent among those who opposed the king's ambitions. Hincmar rallied bishops from neighboring dioceses, solidifying the Church's resistance. They drafted letters to Pope Nicholas I, detailing Lothir's transgressions and seeking his intervention. The conflict was escalating into a direct challenge to royal authority. Lothair, sensing the shift in power, began to apply pressure to local synods, hoping to influence them to grant him the divorce he so desperately desired. He used promises of land and influence to sway the bishops, but his efforts were met with mixed success. Adalberga, isolated from the political maneuvering, could only offer Lothair her unwavering support. She wrote letters, attempting to soothe his anxieties and reaffirm her commitment to him, even as the odds seemed increasingly stacked against them. Ingeltrud's web of intrigue expanded, drawing in discontented nobles who resented Lothair's rule. Promises of power and revenge fueled their allegiance, turning the court into a viper's nest of conspiracies. The Pope's condemnation of Lothair's actions sent shockwaves through Lotharingia. Hincmar, strengthened by Rome's support, became the undisputed leader of the opposition. The balance of power was shifting, and Lothair's throne was growing increasingly precarious. Lothair, aware of the crumbling support around him, addressed his court, attempting to rally them to his cause. But his words rang hollow, and the nobles listened with thinly veiled skepticism. The king's authority was waning, and the kingdom teetered on the brink of chaos. As the political storm intensified, Adalberga could only watch and wait, knowing that the fate of Lotharingia and her own destiny hung in the balance. The perilous throne was about to claim another victim. Aachen, 860 AD. The air in the palace's grand hall crackled with tension. Lothair had convened a synod, a gathering of bishops meant to legitimize his desires. He sought their blessing, their sanction, on a matter that threatened to tear his kingdom apart: his divorce. Among the sea of faces, one stood out: Hincmar of Reims. His presence was a stark reminder of the power Lothair sought to circumvent, a beacon of unwavering faith in the face of royal decree. Lothair presented his case, a carefully constructed narrative of Ingeltrud's alleged transgressions, a desperate attempt to justify his actions under the guise of righteousness. He spoke of the kingdom's need for an heir, a plea that masked his personal desires. Far from the grand hall, Ingeltrud remained, a silent victim of Lothair's ambition. The news of the synod reached her, each whispered word a fresh wound to her pride and her position. Adalberga, hidden from view, was a silent participant in the drama unfolding. Her future hung in the balance, dependent on the outcome of this carefully orchestrated event. Hincmar's response was a thunderclap. He challenged Lothair's every claim, citing canon law and the sanctity of marriage. His words were a gauntlet thrown, a direct challenge to the king's authority. Lothair's anger flared. He had expected compliance, not defiance. The synod, meant to be a mere formality, was turning into a battleground. Fear spread amongst the bishops. Caught between their loyalty to the crown and their allegiance to the church, they were paralyzed by indecision. Hincmar, sensing their uncertainty, pressed his advantage. He reminded them of their sacred oaths, of the eternal consequences of their actions. His words were a rallying cry for those who dared to oppose the king. Lothair's patience frayed. The synod was slipping from his grasp. The threat of violence hung heavy in the air, a stark reminder of the king's power and his desperation. A crack appeared in the facade of royal power. A handful of bishops, emboldened by Hincmar's defiance, refused to yield. Their dissent was a spark, threatening to ignite a rebellion against Lothair's will. Adalberga watched, her hopes dwindling with each moment of defiance. The throne she had envisioned, the future she had dreamt of, seemed to recede further into the shadows, threatened by the unwavering principles of the Church and the growing instability of Lothhair's reign. Archbishop Hincmar, witnessing the defiance of Lothair and the corruption of the local synods, knew he had to appeal to the highest authority. The fate of Lotharingia, and indeed the very principles of Christian marriage, hung in the balance. He penned a desperate plea to Pope Nicholas I, detailing the king's transgressions and begging for intervention. The messenger, bearing Hincmar's urgent letter, embarked on a perilous journey south, braving treacherous mountain passes and the uncertainties of the road. Every league covered brought him closer to Rome, closer to the judgment that could reshape Lotharingia's destiny. In Rome, Pope Nicholas I received Hincmar's letter with grave concern. He was a staunch defender of church doctrine and viewed Lothair's actions as a direct challenge to papal authority. The implications of allowing a king to so brazenly disregard canon law were deeply troubling. Unaware of the impending storm brewing in Rome, Lothair continued to consolidate his position within Lotharingia. He believed that with enough pressure, he could force the remaining bishops to submit to his will and legitimize his divorce. Adalberga, though seemingly removed from the direct political machinations, understood the precariousness of her position. She yearned for stability, for a future free from the constant threat of scandal and excommunication. Ingeltrude, cast aside and publicly humiliated, watched and waited. She knew that Lothair's actions had far-reaching consequences, and she believed that justice, however delayed, would ultimately prevail. The blow fell swiftly and decisively. A papal envoy arrived in Aachen, bearing a bull from Pope Nicholas I. The document condemned Lothair's attempts to divorce Ingeltrude and declared his marriage to her valid and indissoluble. Lothair's reaction was one of fury and defiance. He crumpled the papal bull in his fist, a gesture of open rebellion against the authority of Rome. He refused to yield, determined to pursue his own course, regardless of the consequences. Hincmar, upon hearing of the Pope's decision, offered a prayer of thanksgiving. He saw the intervention of Rome as a victory for the Church and a reaffirmation of the sanctity of marriage. However, the Pope's condemnation further destabilized Lotharingia. Rebellious factions, emboldened by the Church's stance, began to openly challenge Lothair's authority. The kingdom was teetering on the brink of civil war. Lothair, isolated and facing opposition from both the Church and his own vassals, began to feel the weight of his crown. His ambition had led him into a perilous situation, one from which there seemed to be no easy escape. Adalberga watched as the kingdom fractured around her. She knew that the Pope's intervention had changed everything. The throne was no longer secure, and the future was uncertain. The halls of Aachen, once bustling with the promise of a renewed Carolingian dynasty, now echoed with the whispers of discontent. Lothair's defiance of the Church and his pursuit of Adalberga had fractured his kingdom, igniting a flame of rebellion that threatened to consume all. Adalberga watched as the kingdom crumbled around her. Once viewed as Lothair's salvation, she now bore the weight of the kingdom's turmoil on her shoulders, aware of the resentment her presence stirred. Hincmar, ever vigilant, saw the burgeoning rebellion as an opportunity to restore order and uphold the sanctity of canon law. He rallied disgruntled nobles, men who saw Lothair's actions as a sign of weakness and an excuse to seize power. Ingeltrude, scorned and cast aside, harbored a deep resentment towards Lothair and Adalberga. She saw an opportunity for revenge and secretly courted alliances with neighboring kingdoms, eager to exploit Lotharingia's internal strife. Lothair, oblivious to the depth of the conspiracies against him, attempted to quell the growing unrest with displays of royal authority. But his presence only served to further inflame the passions of his rebellious subjects. Adalberga, proving to be more than just a pretty face, began to advise Lothair on military matters, her sharp intellect and strategic thinking providing valuable insights amidst the chaos. Hincmar, using the pulpit as his stage, condemned Lothair's actions, stirring the religious fervor of the populace and further eroding the king's legitimacy. Ingeltrude, receiving confirmation of the neighboring kingdom's support, moved forward with her plan to destabilize Lotharingia, fueling the rebellion from behind the scenes. Lothair, finally realizing the extent of the betrayal, confronted the rebellious nobles, but his words were met with defiance and open hostility. The kingdom was on the brink of civil war. Amidst the chaos of the escalating conflict, Adalberga displayed unexpected courage, tending to the wounded on the battlefield and earning the respect of the common soldiers. Hincmar, seeking to prevent further bloodshed, attempted to broker a peace agreement between Lothair and the rebellious factions, subtly maneuvering to ensure the church's influence remained paramount. Lothair, isolated and betrayed, watched as his kingdom slipped away, the consequences of his ambition and defiance now bearing their bitter fruit. The throne, once a symbol of power and glory, now seemed like a precarious perch on the edge of a precipice. Adalberga found herself increasingly isolated, a gilded cage her only reality. The whispers followed her, the accusations of influence and manipulation, all magnified by Lothair's desperate actions. The court regarded her with a mixture of envy and scorn, a woman who had captivated a king, but now faced the consequences of his ambition. Lothair, ever the determined sovereign, sought to reassure Adalberga. He promised her protection, a place by his side, perhaps even a future as his queen, yet his words rang hollow against the rising tide of condemnation from the church and the growing unrest within his kingdom. Hincmar, in his unwavering commitment to canon law, viewed Adalberga as a symbol of Lothair's moral decay. He saw her as an instrument of the king's ambition, a woman whose presence threatened the very foundation of Christian marriage and the stability of the realm. The weight of the kingdom's turmoil pressed heavily on Adalberga. She began to question her own role in the unfolding drama, wondering if her presence had inadvertently fueled Lothair's recklessness and endangered the stability of Lotharingia. Lothair, facing increasing pressure from all sides, became more resolute in his defense of Adalberga. He refused to yield to the demands of the church, seeing their opposition as an encroachment on his royal authority and his personal freedom. Ingeltrude, fueled by bitterness and a thirst for revenge, saw Adalberga as her nemesis, the woman who had stolen her husband and her rightful place as queen. She began to plot against Adalberga, seeking to undermine her position and expose her perceived flaws to the court. In the quiet sanctuary of the chapel, Adalberga sought solace and guidance. She prayed for the wisdom to navigate the treacherous waters of the court, for the strength to endure the trials that lay ahead, and for the well-being of Lotharingia, a kingdom teetering on the brink of collapse. Lothair's preoccupation with his marital affairs and his attachment to Adalberga distracted him from the pressing matters of state. Neighboring kingdoms, sensing weakness, began to encroach on Lotharingian territory, further destabilizing the realm. Hincmar, using his pulpit as a platform, continued to denounce Lothair's actions and Adalberga's influence, stirring up public sentiment against the king and his pursuit of personal desires over the well-being of his kingdom. As Lothir's health waned, Adalberga's loyalty and devotion were undeniable. She remained by his side, offering comfort and support, even as the kingdom crumbled around them. Her actions, though born of love, served only to intensify the controversy surrounding her presence. Lothair, weakened and disillusioned, began to realize the extent of the damage his actions had wrought. The pursuit of his desires had blinded him to the needs of his kingdom and the consequences of his defiance. As Lothair journeyed towards his fateful end, Adalberga was left to contemplate her uncertain future. Her association with the king had made her a target, a pawn in a larger game of power and politics. Her fate, like that of Lotharingia, hung precariously in the balance. Lothair, unyielding in his ambition, refused to yield to the church's decrees. Each papal condemnation only hardened his resolve. He saw himself as a king divinely appointed, his will not to be questioned by any earthly power, be it religious or secular. Hincmar of Reims, a pillar of the church, rallied his fellow bishops. He thundered against Lothair's defiance, painting a picture of a kingdom spiraling into moral decay. The archbishop warned of divine retribution, of a kingdom crumbling under the weight of its king's sins. Adalberga, the object of Lothair's affections, found herself caught in the storm's eye. The whispers and accusations swirled around her, turning her life into a gilded cage. She was a pawn in a game of power, her fate intertwined with the king's. Lothair's political support began to erode. Powerful nobles, sensing the shifting tides, distanced themselves from the increasingly isolated king. Whispers of rebellion filled the halls of the palace. Ingeltrude, the wronged queen, watched from the shadows. Her heart, once filled with love, was now a vessel of bitterness. She saw Lothair's downfall as a twisted form of justice. Hincmar continued his correspondence with Rome, keeping Pope Nicholas I informed of the unfolding crisis. He skillfully maneuvered the church's power, ensuring that Lothair's actions would not go unchallenged. Lothair, desperate to retain his power, attempted to rally his remaining loyalists. He promised rewards, threatened punishments, but the air was thick with doubt and fear. His words rang hollow in the face of the growing opposition. Adalberga, realizing the precariousness of her position, prepared for the inevitable. She knew that the king's downfall would mean her own exile, her dreams of a crown shattered. Lothair, now a shadow of his former self, was forced to travel to Italy to seek reconciliation with the Pope Nicholas I's successor, Adrian II. His kingdom was crumbling, his power waning with each passing day. He was a king without a crown, a leader without followers. Hincmar, upon hearing of Lothair's journey to Italy, knew that the end was near. The church had weathered the storm, its authority reaffirmed. Lothair's defiance had ultimately led to his downfall. Lothair, weakened and defeated, fell ill on his return journey. He died a broken man, far from his kingdom, without a legitimate heir to secure his legacy. His reign, once full of promise, ended in tragedy. Lothair's death plunged Lotharingia into chaos. The kingdom was divided amongst his uncles, Charles the Bald and Louis the German, setting the stage for future conflicts and weakening the Carolingian Empire. His ambition, his defiance, had ultimately led to the empire's peril. Lothair, weakened by years of defiance and illness, lay on his deathbed in Italy. The fever raged within him, a final, merciless battle against a body worn down by political strife and personal turmoil. His reign, defined by ambition and conflict, was nearing its end, leaving Lotharingia's future uncertain. Adalberga watched from afar, her heart heavy with sorrow and regret. Her presence, once a source of ambition and conflict, was now a silent testament to the fallen king's desires and the kingdom's unraveling. The consequences of their choices loomed large, casting a shadow over the future. In Reims, Archbishop Hincmar prayed. The news of Lothaire's death brought a complex mix of emotions. He mourned the king's passing but also recognized the consequences of his defiance. Hincmar knew the church had weathered a perilous storm, but the kingdom now faced a tempest of its own making. With Lothair gone and no legitimate heir to succeed him, Lotharingia was divided amongst his uncles, Charles the Bald and Louis the German, through the Treaty of Meersen. The kingdom, once a buffer between East and West Francia, became a prize fought over by ambitious rulers. In the ethereal realm, perhaps, Lothair watched as his kingdom crumbled. The pursuit of personal desires and the defiance of moral principles had led to the very outcome he sought to prevent: the fragmentation of his realm and the weakening of the Carolingian dynasty. Hincmar, ever vigilant, documented the events, acutely aware of the historical weight of the kingdom's fall. His writings served as a chronicle of Lothair's reign, a testament to the consequences of unchecked ambition and the enduring power of moral principles. Adalberga, now living in seclusion, reflected on the tumultuous events that had shaped her life. The allure of power and the promise of a crown had faded, leaving behind a legacy of sorrow and regret. She was a reminder of the human cost of political ambition. In Geltrude, observing the division of Lotharingia, felt a cold satisfaction. Her abandonment and the wrongs committed against her had contributed to the kingdom's downfall. Though not a victor, she found a perverse sense of justice in the ruin Lothair had wrought. The people of Lotharingia suffered the consequences of their king's actions. Trade dwindled, and prosperity waned as the kingdom fractured. The stability they once knew was replaced by uncertainty and conflict. The Carolingian nobles, driven by ambition and greed, squabbled over the remnants of Lotharingia. Their infighting further destabilized the region, prolonging the suffering of the people and erasing Lothair's reign from significance. Hincmar, in his sermons, emphasized the importance of moral leadership and adherence to canon law. He sought to guide the remaining Carolingians toward a more righteous path, hoping to prevent further fragmentation and restore stability to the region. The ruins of the Carolingian palace served as a poignant reminder of the ephemeral nature of power. Lotharingia's fall was a cautionary tale, illustrating the consequences of unchecked ambition, moral compromise, and the fragility of political stability in the medieval world. The echoes of Lothair's reign would reverberate through the annals of history, a stark reminder of the perils of a throne built on shifting sands.